to the MessianTics podcast, a podcast about all things Messianic Judaism. Each episode, we will be sharing our opinions as we tackle some of the biggest issues in Messianic Judaism. Now here's your hosts, Rabbis Eric, David, Jonathan, and Toby. Hey guys, and thanks for joining us for another episode of the MessianTics podcast. Today we're going to dive into another listener question, and that question is from Joe. It says, having lived in Israel for 3 months and New York City for 3 years, it can be disheartening to see the slow growth of Messianic Judaism. Do you envision a Messianic Jewish synagogue to be in every major city of the U.S.? Why or why not? And so I'm gonna throw that one out there, and we're just gonna kind of volley this question around for a bit and see which direction this takes us, and chase that around for a little while. So who would like to jump in off the bat?
I think that for me, the slow growth, and I've heard of this. I don't remember where we were at. It might have been a Rabbis conference. It might have been an IMCS Rabbis conference when I heard it, but it was about that there were congregations in New York particularly, and the reason why New York is because of the concentration of Jewish people in New York. And if I'm not mistaken, this person said that you had some congregations actually die. What I mean is there was no one to lead, and the congregation just dissipated. Or you had congregations that didn't have leaders, or things like that. And there are areas of New York that are heavily Jewish that I think don't even have a Messianic congregation was mentioned. I don't know the exact locations, but just think of New York City as a whole and how massive it is, and a lot of Jewish people are there. And I think that for me, a real problem is even in Messianic Judaism, unless there is a policy enforced by the synagogue, most Messianic congregations, and please correct me, most Messianic congregations are mostly non-Jewish. Most. I mean, I would even say most of the Messianic movement is probably, and the reason why is if you take any kind of cross-section of any kind of population, Jewish people will always be a minority. In fact, God told them, He goes, I chose you because you were the least. I think least in number and all those things. He said, I chose you because I love you. And that is why the Jewish people have endured, and I think that is why they're special and unique. And God said it had nothing to do with you as a people as much as just what made you special is that I loved you and chose you to be a light to the nations, right? But I think that so there are two main organizations, I suppose. There's the MJAA and there's the UMJC, and they couldn't be more different. And I think a lot of this has to do with, I think, a real question as far as the slow growth and as far as leaderless congregations is we have to look at and examine and ask questions about the process in which we're raising leaders up. We have to look at that. I don't think we should just hand congregations out like candy, or hand smicha and ordination out like candy. But I think we need to look at it because when I look at the IMCS and I compare it to, say, the UMJC, it's such a massive disparity, a difference in the amount of education. And I think that...
or even the concern with education.
Even the concern with education, maybe, because... And I do think that there's this... I think that there can be a hesitancy. I guess it depends on who you talk to, and I guess maybe it depends on where you're at, but I think there's a hesitancy in some cases to give smicha and ordination maybe to non-Jews. And I think that because Messianic Judaism, I don't like to call Messianic Judaism niche because it's in the book of Acts. We're trying to return to that first century expression, right? But there is... I think there are some things we could learn from the church as far as leadership development and training and stuff. But every year when we're giving smicha to one or two people, and what are we doing and where are we sending them? I don't know. You might have more to say about that, but do you see kind of what I'm trying to approach?
I think that there's some things we are never going to see. I'd love to see, just to answer his question, I envision a Messianic synagogue in every major city. I actually would like to see more than one in every major city because there's more people than that. But we're never going to see that until we deal with a couple of issues. One is the one you mentioned. It's this fear of non-Jewish people that tends to be. Number two, until the Messianic movement in the United States starts to care about the United States as a movement, most of our effort goes to supporting things in Israel, goes to supporting things in the Ukraine, goes to supporting things in other places. And I'm all for that. But until we start as a organization, or as all of the organizations actually saying America still has almost half of the Jews in the world and a lot of non-Jews, and until we start putting a focus on that, we're never going to see that. Number three, until we stop acting out of self-preservation and start acting as an organization. The truth is that if the Messianic Jewish movement would work together, within just a couple of years, every existing Messianic synagogue could be debt-free, and we could be pooling resources together to start new congregations. But instead of working together to be a blessing to each other, we don't. We're self-preservationists. We're just trying to survive on our own amidst this organization of self-sovereign congregations all trying to self-preserve. And until we change those functions, we're never going to see the growth that we could see. And that's apart from the fact that we have young leaders and older leaders that aren't being encouraged to start new congregations with the assistance of an organization. Largely, when somebody starts a new congregation, they're kind of cast into a new city and then left to survive on their own for a few years. And as a matter of fact, in the IMCS, if you want to become an IMCS congregation, you have to be 2 or 3 years old as a congregation before they'll even recognize you as one to bring you into the organization. So if you go to a new city and you survive for 2 or 3 years on your own, fighting the wolves and doing all that, then we'll welcome you into the organization. Where we need to be, as organizations, as a movement, sending people with support, with encouragement to new cities to do that. And until we do those 4 things, we're never going to see a growth and see congregations in cities. Because, for instance, if you go to New York, and this has been tried in New York City, you go there, first of all, a small, brand new congregation doesn't have the resources to survive in a city like New York, to rent a place, to pay the utilities, to do the things that need to be just to get your feet going. And that's in New York City. If you go to other places, it's a little less expensive, but it's still not feasible unless you have your own resources to go into. But if we as a movement would work together regardless of affiliation, to work together to do that. Like I said, we could pay off in less than 3 years every known Messianic synagogue in either the Union or the IMCS that owes money could be paid off if we would pull resources and work together.
I just want to say real quick, because I don't want it to become a too convoluted conversation. So one of the solutions or one of the issues is we're not working together. We're too autonomous. We're too much of a collection of islands. Right?
Yes.
So there's that. There is the Jew and non-Jew thing, and I just want to say this before I know Dave was going to say something. If you have a congregation that's waiting around for there's people that could lead, or there's either people that have been raised up in the congregation or that could be sent there. But if they're like, well, we're waiting for a Jewish guy, we really want a Jewish person, whether it's because they're Jewish or Jewish according to the MJRC, well, we're waiting for that. Well, you might be waiting until you dissipate. You know what I'm saying? At some point, that's a moral issue that the Messianic movement has to get past. And that's the 2 things we've kind of hit on.
So I want to note a couple of things. Having been in New York, I went to Nyack College for my undergrad and their Messianic Jewish Studies program. And while I was there, I worked with Rabbi David Rosenberg at Shiva Yisrael in Long Island for 5 years as his rabbinic intern. And during that time, we also started a Shuvah Israel on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, which I would say for a startup congregation on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, a heavily Jewish area, was a pretty successful congregation. Ended up being the downfall to that particular congregation in Manhattan was the same issue we're talking about. There wasn't anybody to take it over. God had called our associate rabbi elsewhere, had called me and my wife elsewhere, and Rabbi David just wasn't in a position to continue to lead two congregations in two separate areas by himself. But the reality is, you could have 1,000 Messianic synagogues with 1,000 Jewish people each in the boroughs of New York and still barely scratch the surface of reaching the Jewish community. But what we really have is, you have Bruce Cohen's congregation in Manhattan. You have a couple of Chosen People Ministries congregations in Brooklyn, and they may have one in Manhattan. I can't remember for sure. But they've got a couple of, maybe in Queens, something like that. They've got a couple of congregations, especially a Russian-speaking congregation and such, that are connected to CPM. You have 2 or 3 Messianic congregations on Long Island. And then you have one in Rockland County, in Spring Valley. Or maybe it's in Nanuet. One of the two, Spring Valley, Nanuet, I forget exactly. But nonetheless, that's it. That is the Messianic Jewish congregational representation in New York City and the greater metropolitan New York City area. Now, you go upstate, you got several, right? You've got Syracuse and Rochester and Albany and Buffalo, and they all have. There's a number of them up there. Ithaca, I think, has one. There's a number of Messianic synagogues in upstate New York. I mean, I'm talking like virtually Canada, New York upstate, not like Rockland County upstate. But when you're in the metropolitan area, there just aren't any. And part of it is the resources are very difficult to come by. And the truth is that there are not enough resources available to help plant congregations, which is a major problem. Like, I spoke with the individual that submitted this question. I spoke with him. I was like, "Hey, have you ever thought about doing that? You're familiar. Have you ever thought about it?" He said, "Well, who's going to support it? Like, with what resources? That's an issue. Like, there isn't a network developed for resources. There isn't a mechanism for that." The other side of that conversation too is, I think as a whole, Messianic Judaism has been so feverishly focused on metropolitan areas for trying to plant congregations that we've ignored the fact that there are hundreds of thousands of Jews scattered around the U.S. in non-metropolitan areas. For instance, our area in our congregations in Daphne between Baldwin County and Mobile County, Alabama, there's somewhere between 20 and 25,000 Jewish people. Overwhelming majority of them completely non-religious, entirely secular. There's a total of a little less than 1,000 of that 20 to 25,000 Jewish people represented between membership of the conservative and Reformed synagogue in Mobile. Like I said, there's 20 to 25,000 Jewish people there. That's way more than any singular Messianic congregation can handle on themselves. And this isn't even looking at the reality that we should also be reaching the nations, right? I'm not even getting to that yet. So my question has, and people will ask me, like, in both the IMCS and the UMJC, people go, you're in Alabama? I was like, yeah, down on the Gulf Coast. Are there even Jews in Alabama? Well, yes, there are. In fact, Mobile has a very long-standing, historically Jewish community, as does, South Mississippi, as does Louisiana, as does Georgia, as does, there's
Charleston.
Yeah. And so my question has always been, how few Jews is too few to care about their salvation? Right? Abraham was willing to go all the way down to 10 righteous men. And I think that was, and that's where we get a minion from, and so on, the concept for a minion. Abraham went all the way down to 10 righteous men when dealing with Sodom and Gomorrah. Like, how few are too few for us to care about?
God sent Philip from a city to the desert to preach to one person.
Yeah. And so that's my big question. How few is too few to care about? The other thing is, and I fervently believe this. We talk about this a lot at CMC. I've written on it in books. I fervently believe that in order for a Messianic synagogue to be effective in reaching the Jewish community with the good news of Messiah, we have to understand that just because the congregation's primary objective is to reach the Jewish community for Messiah doesn't mean that the individuals within that congregation's primary objective biblically has changed, right? And so as a Jewish person, biblically speaking, my primary objective is still to be a light to the nations. And the Gentiles in my congregation, their primary objective is still to be a light to the Jews. So in order for, in my opinion, in order for a Messianic synagogue to truly be effective, we have to have Jewish believers reaching Gentiles who will then turn around and be Gentile believers reaching Jews. And we have to work together cyclically. I don't think personally, now there are a lot of Jewish people that come to faith in churches. And I think a big part of that is because they encounter the very real presence of God, right? But I don't think there's a lot about a Sunday church that actually, as Paul words it, drives a Judah jealousy for his God. Because even as they're going to that church, most Jewish people still think it's a different God. They come to faith, and then they realize, oh, no, it's not. But they're not being so much driven to their God or to a jealousy for their God. And so I think a Messianic synagogue is the most prime reality for that to come about as we, Jew and Gentile alike, serve the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob through the promised Messiah of Israel. And with that, I think Rabbi Toby's 100% correct. I have zero issue with Gentiles leading Messianic Jewish congregations. As long as they have the adequate training and understanding of what it looks like, how to do it. Can you truly lead a High Holy Day service effectively, and are you equipped to be able to do the things that need to be done in that role, and so on? Honestly, I don't know that a lot of the Messianic rabbis I've met over the years are truly equipped to do that. There's one particular rabbi I know of that I watch lead a Shabbat service once a year and go, this dude looks like he's never done this before in his life. I mean, it's crazy. So, but I think that there are plenty of Gentile believers in Messianic Jewish communities that have a burden for and a calling for leadership in Messianic Jewish congregations that need to be given the ground and the license to do so.
Yeah, I know Jonathan wants to say something, but before we change topics, just realize that Jewish people in the world are about 3% of the population. Messianic Jews are about 3%, 2 to 3% of the Jewish people. So just if you're going by statistics, if we can get non-Jewish believers to reach out to their Jewish friends and Jewish neighbors, we're going to accomplish so much more reaching Jewish people than if only Jewish people reach out to Jewish people. It's just statistics. It's just numbers. And so we can't be afraid of that, because just the fact that 97% of the population are not Jews. And then when you take the 3% that are and you figure the percent of those that are Messianic, the numbers are so insignificant numerically, statistically, that we aren't going to be able to accomplish God's purpose unless we incorporate ourselves along with non-Jewish people.
Yeah, there's I think some of it too is just recognizing the different battles that the different wings of Messianic Judaism are fighting. And I can't say just in Israel, because obviously the Messianic Jewish movement in Israel fights a very different fight than we do here in the States. In the States, it's more of a preservation of Jewish identity as believers in Yeshua. Whereas in Israel, there's almost this fight to get away from Judaism. And again, part of that's just because, if you are entrenched in particularly Orthodox Judaism, there is no one ever talks about Yeshua. Or at least in the context that they're hearing, of Christ, of Jesus, because that's what they're normally hearing from missionaries and those who are, bringing the gospel to most of those Jewish communities. Matter of fact, I would be willing to bet a good portion of my annual salary that most of the time, most of the Jews that come to faith are approached by the gospel, and they're approached with it from a more evangelical perspective, not a messianic one. The fact is the church has been doing it longer. They're better at it. They have the ability to bring people in, and the fact is that like we've talked, like David mentioned, there are they have a true experience with God, in these churches, or with people that are bringing the gospel to them. They meet Christ, they meet Messiah, and when they do, they cannot help but love Him. And so then, now all of a sudden, you are faced with a dilemma because you love this person whom your family, your entire religion hates with a burning passion. And so they do everything they can to get away from that. And so that's particularly what you see in Israel. Of course, in a lot of cases, even in the U.S., you see that as well, where you see people who, and a lot of times they get ostracized by their families too. So even if they wanted to remain Jewish in some way, they're sometimes just not allowed to be Jewish. Their synagogue kicks them out, their family kicks them out, and so now they're like, well, the only people that care about me are the people here at Billy Bob's Southern Baptist Church, on the corner of town. So, and that's reality. And yeah, we are small. We don't. The Messianic movement really doesn't. Now, there are places that are different. Obviously, Chosen People and Jews for Jesus have a lot more focus on evangelizing. But most Messianic congregations, their focus just doesn't include that. There's so many of them are in the trenches of just trying to make it as a group, and are we talk about everyone's 2 paychecks away from being belly up, in this country. Most Messianic congregations are, 2 Shabbats away from, not being a congregation anymore, either through a congregational split or, being, cast off from their fellowship organization in some political dispute. So, yeah, there's a lot of internal issues that prevent us from growing. But there's also that external fact that if you were a serious Jew, if you were a serious religious Jewish person, the only thing you probably ever heard about Yeshua was negative. The only thing you ever heard about the New Testament, that it was negative. And so then when you fall in love with it, when you fall in love with the author, then you have to decide between, do I follow after this person I love and would die for, or do I try to somehow balance that love with a system that hates him? And so that's I think a lot of Jewish people in America, and definitely in Israel, that's their battle. And so that's where they decide, I'm going to go into the more evangelical thing that loves Messiah, and because I love Messiah. And Messianic Judaism is just such a small and rather quiet movement. And I will use the word niche, not because it's not old, but because in the modern sense we are, different, and not as well heard of. And so there are a lot of Jewish people who just haven't heard of the idea that you can somehow still, conform to and practice Jewish traditions in a biblical light while also loving Messiah. So I think that's the battle that a lot of them face, and that's why they end up in churches and not in Messianic synagogues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think most Jewish believers are in churches, right?
Oh yeah,
not even in
by an overwhelming majority.
Yeah,
overwhelming.
I think for some of them, it's just like, yeah, I don't want to do that stuff anymore. Right. I mean, okay, that's fine. I'm not. Right. That doesn't. It's not. It doesn't change God's view of them over someone else.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Also, I think for some, it's a equation. Well, I think it's a dual thing. I think in the church, we talked about this some last night in our study at CMC. Most churches today, and I say most because there's always outliers and exceptions. Excuse me.
Bless you.
Especially your high churches and such that have more traditional liturgical, etc. approach to the way they do things are a little longer. But most churches today typically are an hour, 20 minutes or so for their service or less. Most of the churches in our area that the larger, more quote unquote effective churches are an hour or less on their service every single week.
4 different services, 4 different hours.
And so when you think about, if you're a Jewish person who, went to synagogue until you had a bar mitzvah, which, if we're honest about it, most Jewish people in America, their parents start them going to synagogue about 8, 9 years old so they can get used to it and get prepared for their bar mitzvah. They might go through Hebrew school when they're younger. And then for most Jewish families, once the kids have their bar mitzvah, they bounce. Like, that's the last time they go to synagogue. They're not in synagogue on any regular basis. They show up for holidays, and that's about it. So if what you remember about your experience in a synagogue is a 3-hour heavy Hebrew liturgical service that your memory as a 13-year-old is that was dry and boring and elongated more than necessary and whatever, but then you come to faith in Yeshua in a church that has pomp and circumstance and light shows and lasers and all the best tech everywhere,
feel good emotive music,
and very emotive music, emotive driven music and what have you, and you only got to put an hour into it, and it's on a Sunday morning. You get to have your Saturdays to go golfing or fishing or sports events or whatever else. You get to go, Saturdays are your day to do whatever you want. Like, that's a big sell. And for somebody that really didn't have a lot of value in a traditional Jewish experience to begin with, there's not that big of a significance and difference in what they're doing. Now, there are a lot of Jewish people that come to faith in churches, spend years in churches, and then later on go, wait a second, I kind of miss this, and I can do this and still have Messiah and come back to it, right? So I think that there is that aspect to it, but I think Messianic Judaism, in a lot of ways, we're missing the mark on so many issues. Like, we've talked about it already, the fact that there are so many congregations that are either without a leader or are on the verge of being without a leader because their leader is an octogenarian or worse, and not that that's a bad thing. I don't mean or worse like it's a terrible thing, but they're 80, 90 years old, 70, 80, 90 years old. They realize their time's running out on being able to lead a congregation, but they don't have anybody under them, and so many of them don't have an associate leader or the ability to hire a new leader to take it over.
Or worse, they doubled down on being like, I'm going to live forever, and I'm just great because I'm,
take my pulpit out my cold dead hands. I've heard a Messianic rabbi say that. And so the reality is that they've never planned for that transition. They've never financially, as a congregation, planned for paying a salary to another leader or whatever. So there's no funds for it. And I've heard a lot of these older rabbis that'll say, well, we would love to bring somebody in, but we just can't afford it. We just don't have the money for it. That you need to fix that. You need to fix it quickly. I think less of the issue is whether or not there should or shouldn't be more efforts in planting more congregations, especially in metropolitan areas. I think the reality is we're already hemorrhaging at the fact that we can't fill pulpits that already exist, much less start new ones that don't have somebody to fill those pulpits. Yeah. And a big part of it is, it goes back to what we said earlier, there's no mechanized effort, a unified mechanized effort to make those realities possible, right? New York City, again, we'll talk about it. New York City, a studio apartment. You're not going to get a studio apartment for less than $3,000 a month in most of the boroughs, right? And I'm being generous there. I've seen them as high as $5,200, $5,500 a month just for a simple little studio apartment. And you're talking, you want to bring a younger leader in, let's say 30, 40-year-old younger leader, probably has a wife, maybe a kid or two. That isn't going to float. That's not going to be enough. And so they're going into a very hard market. I mean, not to talk about it necessarily in business terms, but going into a very difficult market to break into, right? You've got a huge population of Jewish people in New York, in the boroughs of New York City. You're going into a very hard market. You're going in there with no backing from an organization, generally speaking, or if it is, it's very minimal, a couple $100 a month or whatever. You're starting from scratch. You've got to find a facility that will let you use their space and hope that you can figure out a way to afford to pay for the rent to use that space. And then you've got to figure out where in the world are we going to live? Where are we going to, where are my kids going to have to sleep? What are we going to do? Right? It's a very difficult setup. It's a very, very difficult process. What we need is some sort of mechanism in place to assist individuals in starting congregations, and not just in the metro areas, literally anywhere.
Right, and we have to understand and remember that within our congregations, there are the people to lead these congregations. The problem is that the people with giftings and talents and abilities, we don't want to leave our congregation because we want the body there. We want them to be there to teach at our congregation and do what we want them to do and so on. And there are some people that are called to do that in our congregations, but many times there are people that God has called that we don't release to go, encourage to go, bless to go, and send to go because we don't want to lose a solid congregant from our community, because we don't want to give up that income or that help or that person to go somewhere else. So we don't, and other places do without, and those people end up stagnating because we can't use them enough to keep them encouraged and enlivened in their gifting and calling, because we're doing it because we have to speak, we have to get our income, we have to get our face time in front of the congregation, we have to, all of the we have to's. And so part of that problem is we don't release people that do have callings and giftings to do that, and not just release them but send them. When Paul sent people places, he didn't just say, pack up your bags and go survive, but they provided resources to go with them. Yeah.
I think, the more conferences I go to and have been at, particularly, leadership conferences, and I look around at especially like the age dynamics, I don't like being the doom bearer, but if something doesn't radically shift in the next decade, it's not too late right now, but the hour is late.
Yeah.
And it is, I can't help but sit and think here, and I'm just like, I feel like Gamliel. We'll see if all of this was of God or not in the next 10 to 20 years. Because, birthed out of the Jesus movement, the charismatic response to Jewish believers, setting up places for themselves to retain their Jewish identity with faith in Messiah, took off, in the 60s and 70s. It's lasted until now, and now we find ourselves at the precipice of, will this continue on? Will this be something? Will this be the end-time revival of God's people or not? And I'm waiting to see if that happens, because I'm such an optimist most times. I can tell you that I'm not optimistic about this. And I say that very hesitantly. But my wife and I have had those conversations, and I've told her, by the time Eli is old, I don't think outside of myself here at Brenham, I don't know if he'll have another Messianic congregation to attend. I don't know if that will exist elsewhere in 30 years, 40 years. Unless the people who have the ability to make changes now step up to the plate, get off the fourth point of contact, pull up the big boy pants, big girl pants, and actually put some work into the work that they've been given to do. Because if they don't, then all the work of all the pioneers, all the predecessors who have built what stands now will topple down as every empire that wasn't of God has before. So, with that in mind, we have some work to do.
A lot of work to do. And I don't think that just starting a young adults focused thing with a bunch of selfies on social media is really cutting it yet, but at least there's sort of something.
Yeah.
But yeah, I have the same concern. I know Rabbi Toby does, that our kids are growing up in a movement that appears to be rapidly fading, which is disappointing, especially because I've spent my entire life in this Messianic Jewish movement hearing rabbis purport that this is an end-time revival reality. But then we do nothing to procure a future for it. And you know, the perk to a movement like this is, yes, God sparks something and we start running with it and are a part of what God is doing in it, but we also have a responsibility to steward it. And I think some of the pioneers, the older rabbis, are still, I think they're focused on two things. One is maintaining control of their congregation, of the organization, of whatever. They're focused on maintaining control. To hell with whoever gets hurt in the mix of it, right? That's just the honest reality of it. And the other is they're so desperately concerned about maintaining their pulpit and, you know, being cautious of who they bring into the pulpit and whatever else. And, you know, I've listened to rabbis. I mean, just a couple of years ago, I was at the Rabbis conference, and it was the highest attended by under 40 crowd I had ever seen at the Rabbis conference.
And you've been going since you were a kid.
Yeah, I've been going since I was in middle school. It was the highest under 40 attendance. Let me rephrase, highest under 50 attendance that I had seen ever in all the time that I've gone. But the entire programming of the conference was tailored to the 60, 70, 80 plus crowd, including one rabbi getting up and saying, if you're in your 70s and 80s, the best is still ahead of you. God's not done with you, and your pulpit is yours, and yada, yada. I'm like, you've literally got a third of the room are young leaders who are desperate for an opportunity.
Encouragement.
And being sewn into, and you're spending the entire programming focused on the 60, 70, 80 crowd.
And I can tell you sorry, go.
Yeah, and I'm a big fan of, like, I'm not saying that 50 or 60 or whatever is the cutoff, but look, we talk about the Bible should be a guiding factor for us. Like, God sets up for the armies of Israel to serve from 20 to 60, and he sets up for the priesthood to serve from 30 to 50, right? And the priesthood, when you hit that 50-year mark, and you're no longer able to be a Kohen, or to serve in the role of a Kohen, that doesn't mean you stop being in ministry. That means you start sowing your experience into the next generation that will become Kohanim, right? And I think that there needs to be a focus by our elder rabbis on intentionally building up the next phase of our rabbis, the 20, 30, 40-somethings that want to step into it.
Senior rabbis, people my age and older, shouldn't lose their influence because they step out of their bima. Their influence should be used to train, to mentor, to raise. The fear that if I stop preaching every Shabbat, I'm going to lose my relevance should never come into the mind of the person, because they should be helping to raise up, to train, to teach, to inspire, to encourage other congregations. If that means going, and that doesn't mean that they can't still preach. You could travel. There are enough congregations that senior leaders could go every week to a different congregation and encourage the people there and teach and share.
Give the leader a break.
Yeah, give the leader a break, but also to, Rabbi Solomon started years ago going to other congregations and sitting in a service and then meeting with the leadership after and saying, hey, let me give you some encouragement, some advice, some critiques, some help in doing how to grow, how to do. Now, that's a role that isn't being done by really anybody that's going around and just sharing and saying, look, I just want to, I would love, I've been in the IMCS for 30 years almost. And I would love for one of the leaders from the IMCS to call me and say, hey, I'd like to come by and just visit your congregation, and I don't necessarily have to speak or share. Just want to be there with you. I want to be seen by your congregation. I want them to know that there's people out here that care, that are out here that are supporting you, that are available for reaching out, help, stuff like that. And all the time I've been here, unless I have invited somebody from the IMCS or the union, I haven't had anybody just stop by and say, hey, we were driving by, we wanted to come visit, we were in the area, we wanted to come. We purposely decided to drive to Pensacola not because we were driving through, but just to be there to encourage your community to help. And I would love to see things like that happen.
It would be nice. I suggested this to the IMCS a few years back, that it would be nice if we had regional leaders who, part of their responsibility would be to go visit the congregations in their region at least once every other year, maybe maybe once every year. That they take time away to intentionally go and spend time, not to go and speak necessarily, but to go and see. Like, how are you supposed to have your thumb on the pulse of the movement if you're not actually going anywhere besides your own congregation and 2 conferences a year?
Right.
And it's not just the IMCS, because it's the same situation with the union. If my congregation members want to know who's the leadership of the union or the IMCS or the MJA, they have to get in their car and drive to one of the conferences so that they can meet them. Where in church denominations, there's a presbyter, there's somebody that comes, that represents, that speaks on behalf of, that drops in and says, hey, I'm the regional superintendent, I'm the regional director, I'm somebody from the organization who's come to say hi, to share our love, to encourage, to...
Yeah, if you're Catholic or Orthodox, at least once a year, your bishop comes and leads a service at least once a year.
Yeah, we need something like that. But again, that goes back, and I hate that we keep revisiting this discussion, but that goes back to fellowship versus a relational fellowship versus denomination.
Yeah.
That's just the bottom line of it.
I do not hate visiting this conversation.
I hate that we keep revisiting it because it hasn't been fixed. Well, that it's not one we have to revisit.
Whenever, one of the things you learn in CPR certification is that once you start, you don't need to stop until that person is alive and breathing again. And our movement is actively...
Wait. Repeat that. That was kind of harsh. Repeat that. I think that needs to be heard by a few more people with the movement.
Once you start CPR, you're not supposed to stop. You're not supposed to stop until that person is alive and breathing again. And so, as we stand right now, and again, I say this more as one of the younger leaders, because, looking for... and again, it's not that I don't get the experience and opportunities here, but as speaking as a broader movement, when the biggest thing you can offer me is a pizza night at Messiah Conference.
Yeah.
Our movement...
Don't forget about selfies.
And selfies. Our movement is actively dying. We are watching it fade. And that's not exaggerating, that's not sensationalism, that's not... freaking out. Like, a lot of the leaders in the Messianic movement are so inoculated by the fact that they're constantly surrounded by yes men and, their own movement. They think we're doing well. Those of us who are experiencing the outside world are watching a very different reality. And
imagine how it would appear to our young people, our what we would call the college and career, or the YMJA and above age.
Sure.
If one of the leaders of the movement was to drop in at a congregation and say, hey, I'm here for Shabbat service, but I'd like to meet with your young people this evening and just have ice cream and coffee and just visit with them and encourage them and answer questions, or introduce myself to them and be part of their world.
Right.
Instead of... doing...
Or even just drop in for a vibe check, Yeah,
that's what I'm saying. Just drop in and say, hey, I'm here. Can I do anything for you? Right. What would you like to see the organization do for the young people?
Right. Because my generation, and millennials included, my generation, we're very passionate about seeing the kingdom grow, seeing God's work being done. And the fact is, we will find a way to do it. We've seen that already with young Messianic people. They leave the Messianic movement and go into the church, and they work in churches because the Christian world offers them that opportunity to exercise those gifts and to do God's work. They're doing God's work in those places.
And the truth is that a lot of those young people that are leaving the Messianic movement as the Messianic movement and going into a church are given the opportunity to teach Messianic Judaism within the folds of the church.
Right.
but they're getting a salary and encouragement and provision and support and all of those things there. So it's not like they're leaving Messianic Judaism altogether.
Yeah.
They're teaching Jewish roots classes at a church, or leading a Friday night study at a church, or doing those things that they could do in the Messianic movement if the doors were open, if the finances were there, if those things were provided. So anyhow, I don't want to beat the horse to death. I just want to resuscitate it.
Yeah. So the bottom line in conclusion, do we believe that there should be a Messianic congregation or multiple in every major city? Why or why not? The answer is yes. But I also believe that there should be multiple anywhere where there's a lot of Jewish people specifically, but anywhere where there's a lot of people, right? And so the fact of the matter is in our area, in Mobile and Baldwin County and Escambia County here where Pensacola is located, where Brenham is, the fact of the matter is there is ample enough, and this is, again, and I'm only using the numbers of the Jewish community in the area. That is not to say that we shouldn't focus on the nations as well, because we absolutely should. I'm just putting this out to give some perspective. There are enough Jewish people that need to hear the good news of Messiah in Escambia County, Mobile County, Baldwin County, that we could easily have 40 Messianic synagogues just in this area, these 3 counties, and still not get the job done.
Yeah, and I want to say one
Much
more
less
thing.
what you see in the boroughs of New York or in Boston or in LA or Miami or whatever.
Right.
Yeah, and I want to say one more thing in closing, and that goes to Joe's question about growth. There are congregations growing. Our congregation has grown dramatically in the past 3 or 4 years. Your congregation has grown dramatically in the last 3 or 4 years. The Dothan congregation has grown. The congregations around. There's growth in the Messianic movement. I don't want people to think that there's not growth. There is growth, but there could be more growth if we work together. There could be more growth if we actually planned, prepared, and work together to accomplish that, to raise up, to train, to do things. I don't want people to think that just because it appears in some places that there's not enough congregations or there's not growth. There is growth. We just could do better at it.
Right.
We could do better at managing the growth.
Yes. I will.
To create more growth.
Right. I will compare it to anyone that's studied history of countries in warfare. The country of Rhodesia in Africa. It's a country that establishes itself, lasts for less than 10 years before it falters. In its wars against the enemies that were surrounding it on all sides, it was winning. Mm-hmm. Tactical victory after tactical victory. And what's often said about that event in history is that it was a tactical success, a strategic failure. They were not able to establish the trade, the negotiations, the relationships with other allied countries well enough to build itself a strong foundation and base. And even though it was winning the war, in the end it failed and fell apart because it did not build what a country actually needs. You can't constantly be at war. You cannot constantly be only pioneering. You at some point have to build the foundation that will provide and allow for the growth. Otherwise, the plant will grow big and tall and strong, but then will collapse under the weight of its own growth with no foundation.
And to put it in terms of biblical history, Jewish history, Israel was winning the war against Rome until Israel started fighting amongst themselves.
Yeah.
Israel was when Rome was in Israel. Israel fought against Rome, and they were winning the battles. They were winning. It was so bad that Rome won a small victory, and they brought the leader of that tiny little victory back to Rome to have a parade because they were losing against the Israelite forces who were ragtag, not professional soldiers, all that, until the Jews started fighting amongst themselves, and then they lost the battle. And that's why when we read about the destruction of the temple and the fall of Israel under Roman conquest, the temple fell because of baseless hatred amongst the Jewish people. not because of the Roman armies. And the same thing will happen in the Messianic Jewish movement. If we don't stop fighting amongst ourselves, we're going to have the same end that Israel had in the day. That's not going to stop God's kingdom.
Right.
There's always going to be a remnant. The fullness of what the Bible prophesies will happen.
Right.
The question will be, will we be a part of it?
Right. And it's funny that you bring that up because, even Titus, the Roman general, when he returned to Rome, he refused the wreath of victory. When he came back and for his victory parade after the casting down of Jerusalem. And when asked why he didn't want to wear the wreath of victory, he said, "There's no victory in overthrowing a people whose own God has deserted them." And recognizing that, the Jewish people had left, their God and had left each other. And, in breaking that fellowship and that bond with God and each other, they fell.
Well, we hope that this episode has been a blessing to you. And Joe, we hope that we answered your question. If you have a question you'd like us to answer in an upcoming episode, feel free to put it on our social media or wherever you're listening to this podcast. Please share this podcast, follow us, subscribe, and we appreciate all of our listeners. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the MessianTics podcast. Make sure to subscribe so you can be notified every time we drop a new episode. And be sure to follow and interact with us on social media at MessianTics Podcast.